Welcome to Spreadsheet Geek. In this lesson, we'll talk about a very popular feature in Excel, pivot tables. This video was made using Microsoft Excel 2019. So what is a pivot table? Many people have said it's a way to slice and dice data, and I don't disagree with that, but I prefer to say a pivot table is a way to consolidate data and pull out just the information that you're interested in from a big table of data. Let's talk about data tables for a minute because this is the first thing you're going to need before you create a pivot table. You need a table of data with column headers across the top and data filled in below. This is an example set of data I've created. It's a used car lot scenario. So we have different cars of different styles, makes, models, years, colors, different transmission. We have our cost, and that's a number rather than a word like that. We have a sales price, and we have over here, just note, we have a formula in here for gross margin. So that's sales price minus cost divided by sales price. You want to have your data already set up in this format before you even attempt to create a pivot table, or it's not going to make any sense. So what are our options with respect to pivot tables? Once we get our data set up, there's two options to create a pivot table, and they're both found under the Insert menu. There's Recommended Pivot Tables, which we'll look at first, and then Pivot Tables. Recommended pivot tables is more for people who want Excel to help them and guide them through the process. But with either of these options, the first thing they're going to ask for is what data do you want to analyze? So I didn't have anything selected, so I'm going to go ahead and hit that arrow, select my data, and then arrow back down. And I've designated A1 to I23 as my data. Now Excel wants to see or assumes that you have column headers at the top row. This is probably not the way you want to do it. I'll give you a little trick. If you have your cursor over a cell that's within your data table somewhere and you hit this, Excel is going to put an outline around there and take a guess at what data you want. So in this case, that's correct. And we move on to our next step. And this is what I was talking about, how Excel is showing you different pivot options that you might be interested in. I don't really like that. I normally know exactly what I want when I go in. So that's why I use this option almost all of the time. But there is one thing I do kind of like about this. If you just don't like any of these, you can pull open a blank pivot table and get to the same place you would get to under the other option up here. The one thing I don't like about it is that it always opens up the pivot table on a new worksheet. I prefer to put my pivot tables right next to my data if there's room. And for a small table like this, there's plenty of room over here for a pivot table, which will normally be smaller than your source data. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Let's go back and we'll talk about the other option, which is the more commonly used. As with the recommended pivot tables option, the first thing the pivot table option is going to want is to know what your data range is. Again, I told you it's least preferred to have your cell selected outside your table. It's better to have one inside, but it's even better to have your entire data range selected. So you can click down the left mouse, hold it down, select that entire range of data, hit the pivot table option, and guess what? It already knows what range you've designated. Now, I'd like to say a few words about selecting data because I've seen people struggling with this. This is probably the least preferred method of selecting data. When you're working at a company in a professional environment, your data tables are going to be huge. They could be hundreds of thousands, if not a million rows long or deep, and hundreds of columns wide. So I've literally seen people holding down their mouse key and scrolling down and down the screen for literally 10 minutes trying to select a large data table. I'm going to give you 3 ways to avoid that. The first way, come up here in the upper left-hand corner and you're going to hit in rapid succession, hold down the Shift key, the End key, and the down arrow. Shift End down arrow. Now I held it a little bit too long, so I'm going to back it up. And then you can tab, arrow over to the right and get the rest of your data. Now if this data table is 100,000 rows long, you will zip right to the bottom and you'll be reasonably confident that you get it all. The second way, if you know that your entire worksheet is a data table and that the top row is headers and it's all set up correctly, you can click right here next to this triangle and select the entire worksheet. When I go to pivot table, it's going to be a little bit different. It's only going to show you the top left cell, this A1, and it's not going to have an endpoint. You'll notice that Excel is continuing the outline down further and further. This could be an advantage if you're going to fill in new rows of data over time and you want your pivot table to update itself. We'll look at that in a minute. The third way, my most preferred way, is to click anywhere in your data table and hit Control A. That is not without its pitfalls. However, if you have a situation like this where your company set up a field in their relational tables that they're not using, we're just not using the transmission field. You hit Control A, it still works. But if you have a situation like this where somebody inserted a completely blank column, Control A is not going to get everything. Likewise with a row, Control A, not going to get everything. So let's create a pivot table, and I'm going to go ahead and use my Control A method. If you do that first, you skip the first step because it already knows what data you're looking at. And the second question it's going to ask you is, where do you want the pivot table to be placed? You can go with a new worksheet, or in this case, since I have plenty of room right here, I'm going to choose the existing worksheet, and you can either type in manually the location or just click. This will be the upper left-hand corner of my pivot table, Sheet 5, K4. This option I'm not going to talk about today. It's a more advanced Excel option. You can just leave that unchecked and hit OK. And wow, all this crazy stuff appears on the screen. What is this? So I put in some questions here that we're going to answer, and hopefully this will illustrate the purpose and use of a pivot table better than anything else. What if we, within our used car inventory, wanted to know how many vehicles are in each color? How would I go about doing that? So there's two things to think about there. We've got how many and color. So I'm going to go ahead and put color on the rows. So immediately Excel has created the first part of a pivot table, which has consolidated all of these colors, among which we have duplicates. There's 2 blacks, 2 whites, and etc. These are the only possibilities, these 8 colors. How many vehicles in each color? So for the how many part, it doesn't really matter what I drag over because Excel's just going to count the rows. So I'm going to just pick something at random and say transmissions. Let's put that over in the values. And there's my answer. I have 6 black cars, 2 blue, and so on and so forth. As a second part of this question, what if I only wanted to know how many vehicles are in just black or white? Because those are the 2 most popular colors. Well, I can go here, pull open a menu, and basically I can filter out just the black and white. And the way I would do this is to unselect all and then click black and click white. And then when you hit OK, you get just what you're looking for. Let's look at another question and see if we can figure this one out. This one's a little more detailed. How much money do we have invested in Ford vehicles? So I'm going to go to, let me see, Ford is under make. So let's pull make down into the rows. Like that. There's Ford in the middle, but we've got all our makes there. And the money we have invested, that's our cost. So I'm going to go ahead and pull cost down into the values. So you can see Ford, $55,600. Let's just do a quick check of that. I've got a Ford here and a Ford here and another one, and I think I've got 6 altogether. So those are the values that went into that $55,600. So this is correct. And if we really wanted to summarize just Ford, we would narrow it down to just Ford. There's our answer. How many Hondas are in the inventory? Okay. We're going to do one thing different on this one. Honda is a make. So let's put makes down here. But this time I'm going to go to the columns instead of rows. All this does is lay out your table in a different order. So I've got my makes laid out from left to right rather than from top to bottom. And let's go ahead and reduce that right now down to just Honda, since that's all we're interested in. How do I get the count of Hondas? Well, let's take cost, and we'll put that down in the values. So, do we have 34,500 Hondas? No, I don't think so, since we only have 22 cars in the whole inventory. So there's an adjustment we need to make here, and you need to be on the alert for this when you're using pivot tables. I'm going to move this up temporarily so you can see this menu, but I'm going to go down here to this sum values, and there's a menu you can pull down here. Let me move that up just slightly higher so it's on the screen. You want to go to this value field settings and click on that. And this gives you the mathematical operation that is being used in the pivot table. And right now it's set to sum. So remember, we selected sum of cost. We selected cost. So it's summing up those costs. And that's not what we want. We want the count. So I'm going to move this back down. And we've answered our question. There are 3 Hondas in the inventory, and I think you'll see 2 of them there and another one down here. So that's our question answered. Now remember, our table of data had a formula in this last column. So I wanted to illustrate how pivot tables handle formulas rather than just numbers or words. What is the average margin for sports utility vehicles? So let's go through our normal operation. Sports utility vehicle is a style. So let's pull style down to rows. And for the right-hand column, the margin will be pulled into the values. Okay, is that what we wanted? There's a hint right here. This says sum of margin. So we have sum. We want the average margin. So once again, I'm going to go down to this operation menu for the value field settings, and I'm going to switch that over to average now. Get that back down. So SUVs looks like 23.6% as expressed as a decimal. So let's just see if that's right. I've got 33 here, 20 here, 30, 17, and there's 6 of them all together. So I got 24% down here, and that's 23.6 rounded. So that looks like it's working correctly. There's just 2 more things I want to mention. These look a little unusual because of the formatting, but you can actually click on these pivot tables, copy them, and I'll go ahead and select copy. And you can, and I usually come down here and I paste as values. So you can paste those and then format them correctly as a percentage. Maybe you want to show the decimal place. This is data you can move anywhere you want. The other thing I wanted to talk about briefly is that scenario where you select this data by hitting this area up here. And we said when the pivot table is created by Excel, this continues down to many more rows, and it's kind of an open-ended pivot table. Let's go ahead and put that on our worksheet. So I stated you could add additional rows and rows and rows and keep this pivot table going over time. Let's say we want to know how many let's say we wanted to know how many, what our average cost of Ford Mustangs is. So I'm going to go, let's see, Mustang is a model. So I'm going to put model in the rows. There's our Mustangs. Notice we've got some blanks. These are all the blank rows. So let's go to cost, put that in the values. And we wanted an average cost, not a sum of cost. So I'm going to do that same old routine with the value field settings. I want the average. Let's pull that back down. So our average cost for a Mustang is $12,333. Now, let's say we only want to look at Mustangs on this. I'll select only Mustangs and filter the data. And we get a new Mustang into our inventory. So I'm going to say that it's exactly like this one. Paste that in at the bottom. You notice this didn't change yet. So if you want your pivot table to update with new data in this open-ended scenario, you need to go to Data and refresh the data. So there are some operations in Excel that require you to refresh data, and this is one of them. So when I hit this refresh key, You can see that we have a new updated average cost, and that last Mustang that came in so cheap lowered our average cost. If you've enjoyed the content of this video, please hit my subscribe button and you'll be notified when I post new video content. Thanks for visiting Spreadsheet Geek.